The Grand Meridian Convention Center glowed under towering chandeliers as some of the world's most powerful business figures gathered for the Global Investment Summit. Billionaires, tech founders, and government delegates filled the hall, shaking hands, exchanging cards, posing for photographs. Steven Seagal entered quietly through a side door. No spotlight. No entourage. Just a calm, imposing presence in a simple black coat, moving with the same dignity he carried everywhere. He wasn't there as a celebrity. He was there as a respected board member for two major Asian investment groups, something half the room didn't even know. Across the lobby, a commotion erupted. A swarm of cameras surrounded Alexander Langford, a notoriously arrogant tech billionaire whose $3 billion AI deal had dominated headlines for weeks. He strutted in with a champagne smile, waving to reporters like a man who owned the world already. As fate would have it, the two men crossed paths near the entrance to the main hall. Steven offered a polite nod. Langford glanced sideways, noticing him. With genuine courtesy, Steven extended his hand. A simple, respectful handshake. Langford paused, stared at the hand, then loudly scoffed. "Why is he in here?" he said to his bodyguard, not even addressing Steven. "This event is for serious investors, not old action stars looking for relevance." His voice echoed through the lobby. Heads turned instantly. Several attendees froze, shocked. Steven slowly lowered his hand. There was no anger in his eyes, only a calm disappointment that cut deeper than any outburst ever could. A journalist whispered, "That's Steven Seagal. Does Langford not know who he's talking to?" Langford brushed past, laughing to his assistants. He didn't look back. He didn't apologize. He didn't think he needed to. Steven stood still for a moment, breathing in deeply, letting the humiliation pass through him. Then, without a word, he walked toward the conference hall with the same calm grace he had walked in with. But the room was already buzzing. People had seen it. Phones had recorded it. And murmurs spread like wildfire. But what Steven did next, without raising his voice, would make the entire investment world regret Langford's arrogance. The main hall of the Grand Meridian Convention Center was alive with chatter. Crystal chandeliers reflected off polished marble floors, casting a warm glow over the clusters of investors and entrepreneurs. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the subtle scent of cologne and designer perfume. Steven Seagal moved through it all like a shadow, unassuming yet commanding attention in a quiet, magnetic way. Alexander Langford, still smirking from his earlier slight, held court at his table with several top executives. His booming laugh cut through the room, punctuated by sharp, confident hand gestures. Around him, assistants whispered eagerly, seemingly impressed by his audacity. Langford's eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Steven. He scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "I can't believe they let him in here," he muttered to his assistant. "This isn't Hollywood. This is serious business." Steven noticed. He kept walking, stopping only when a young entrepreneur approached him nervously. The man, clearly flustered, whispered, "Mr. Seagal, that billionaire just insulted you in front of everyone. Some of the investors are uncomfortable." Steven gave a gentle nod. "I know," he said softly, "but reacting in anger only validates their arrogance. Respect shows strength, not the other way around." Meanwhile, Langford continued to dominate the room. He leaned across his table to boast about the latest $3 billion investment deal. "This is the future," he said loudly, tapping his phone, "and anyone who doubts me is just wasting their time." Some attendees shot uncomfortable glances at Langford, murmuring among themselves. A few raised their phones, capturing videos of the scene. Social media had already begun to stir, even before the official keynote had begun. A reporter, trying to stay discreet, whispered to a colleague, "Isn't that Steven Seagal over there? He looks like he just didn't get fazed at all." Jinky-like intuition ran through the crowd. They realized something important. The man they had brushed off wasn't just an entertainer. He was influential in ways Langford didn't even comprehend. But Langford remained oblivious, his arrogance blinding him to the reality around him. The young entrepreneur, noticing the growing attention, urged Steven again, "Maybe you should just leave. Let it slide." Steven shook his head. "I haven't done anything wrong. Walking away now would be the same as saying disrespect is acceptable." The tension in the room grew. Conversations halted as whispers traveled. Cameras discreetly captured the two figures, the calm, composed Steven Seagal and the brash, dismissive Langford. A few bystanders approached, unsure whether to intervene. One of them whispered, "If he just stays calm, this might get interesting." Another pulled out their phone, "I'm recording." Nobody will believe this if it doesn't go viral. Langford noticed the subtle shift in attention but shrugged it off. He raised his glass to toast his table, confident, unaware that the room was beginning to side with the silent figure who refused to bow. As the keynote approached, the organizers subtly tried to redirect attention, but it was too late. The atmosphere had changed. Respect had become the invisible currency of the room, and Langford's arrogance was being assessed in real time. Every eye, every phone, every whispered comment chipped away at his aura of invincibility. Have you ever seen someone publicly disrespected by authority or power? Comment below with your story. Also, tell us which city and country you're watching this story from. We'd love to see how far this story reaches. Steven's calm composure contrasted sharply with Langford's bluster. No dramatic gestures. No shouting. Just quiet, steady dignity. But everyone in the room sensed that the scales were slowly tipping. Langford had miscalculated and the fallout had only just begun. The room was charged now. The chatter of the summit attendees had quieted to a low hum, the kind that comes before something monumental unfolds. Steven Seagal, calm and composed, moved toward the stage where he had been invited to speak briefly on business discipline and global investment strategies. Every step he took was measured, confident, yet unassuming. Alexander Langford, seated at his table, noticed Steven moving through the crowd and frowned. The earlier incident, the rejected handshake, still stung his ego. He leaned toward a colleague and whispered, loud enough for several nearby attendees to hear, "He thinks he can walk in here and lecture us? Who does he think he is?" Langford's arrogance only fueled the growing tension in the room. Steven reached the podium, nodding politely to the host and other guests, and began speaking in a calm, steady voice. "Respect," Steven said, "is not something you demand. It is something you earn. Arrogance, no matter how loudly it speaks, can never replace integrity or discipline." The words were deliberate, measured, and resonated through the hall. The audience leaned in, captivated not just by the words, but by the quiet authority in Steven's presence. Phones started to appear. Journalists, attendees, and even Langford's associates couldn't resist documenting it. Langford's eyes narrowed. He interrupted from his table, his voice dripping with condescension. "This isn't a dojo, old man. Maybe you should stick to action movies." A hush fell over the crowd. Some attendees gasped, others exchanged nervous glances. Langford thought he had landed a clever jab, but Steven didn't flinch. He paused, giving the room a moment to absorb the audacity of the remark. With calm authority, Steven replied, "A dojo, a boardroom, a stage, they are all the same if you understand one rule: respect is universal." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Even Langford's allies began to sense that his bluster was losing power. Whispers spread, "He's not reacting with anger, he's controlling the room." Langford's frustration grew. He gestured sharply at one of his executives, clearly expecting some intervention. But no one moved. They were unsure, caught between loyalty to Langford and the compelling presence of Steven Seagal. A few bystanders started recording video from the audience, capturing Langford's arrogance and Steven's poised responses. Social media notifications buzzed silently across the phones of journalists in the hall, signaling that this moment was about to go viral. Meanwhile, Steven's calm gaze swept over the audience. "Actions speak louder than words," he continued. "And arrogance speaks only for itself, not for the truth." Langford's hand hovered near his glass, as if tempted to assert dominance physically or verbally, but the growing collective attention made him hesitate. The room was no longer just a stage, it had become a courtroom of public opinion. The tension thickened. People whispered, some spoke up subtly, others looked on silently. Langford, despite his wealth and influence, was beginning to feel the pressure of every eye assessing his behavior. If you were standing there as a bystander, would you step in or stay quiet? Type your answer in the comments below. Steven finished his short speech and stepped down from the podium with quiet dignity. He didn't gloat, didn't provoke further, but the shift in the room was palpable. The arrogance that Langford had wielded like a weapon now felt flimsy, fragile, and exposed. By the time Steven walked back to his seat, whispers had escalated into low murmurs of admiration. Phones clicked incessantly, recording every interaction. Some attendees even began quietly discussing investments and partnerships with Steven, recognizing not only his authority but the depth of his influence. Langford, meanwhile, was visibly unsettled. He tried to regain composure, but the subtle disapproval in the room was unmistakable. For the first time that day, he realized that the man he had dismissed with a wave of his hand was someone he had underestimated. And in that quiet, steady presence, Steven Seagal had already begun to turn the tables. The murmurs around the Grand Meridian Convention Center had grown louder. Steven Seagal had returned to his seat, calm and composed, yet every eye in the hall seemed fixed on him. People were talking in hushed tones, exchanging glances, and subtly shifting their chairs to get a better view. The respect he commanded without raising his voice was undeniable. Meanwhile, Alexander Langford was starting to feel the weight of the room's scrutiny. His laughter had faded, replaced with a growing tension that even his assistants couldn't ignore. He noticed subtle side glances, the quiet nods of acknowledgement towards Steven, and the whispers of admiration that trailed behind the actor's calm movements. One young finance reporter, sitting at a nearby table, leaned over to a colleague and whispered, "Wait, isn't that Steven Seagal?" The same Steven Seagal involved with major Asian investment boards. The realization spread like wildfire. A few investors immediately pulled out their phones, sending quick messages to colleagues, confirming what they suspected. Langford had just publicly disrespected someone with substantial influence over billions of dollars. Langford noticed the subtle shift and tried to dismiss it, laughing a little too loudly at a private joke with his team. But the confidence that had filled him moments earlier was fading. He could sense that the room had started weighing his character, not just his wealth. Every smirk, every dismissive glance he had offered Steven now seemed like a miscalculation in front of hundreds of people. Steven, however, remained humble. He didn't bask in the attention or flaunt his connections. He simply engaged politely with attendees near his table, offering calm, measured insights on investment strategies, discipline, and respect in business. His quiet authority contrasted sharply with Langford's increasingly visible frustration. A small group of attendees at the back of the room started murmuring, "He's not just an actor, he's a powerhouse in investment circles too. He could make or break a deal with just a word." Langford's assistant noticed the growing attention and whispered nervously, "Sir, people are starting to question your judgment." Langford waved him off, insisting he still had control. But the damage was done. Investors and journalists were now actively comparing notes, discussing the handshake incident, and noting the calm way Steven had handled public disrespect. In the main hall, a few influential investors approached Steven discreetly, shaking his hand warmly and nodding in respect. Some whispered about partnerships and potential collaborations. It was a quiet affirmation of his influence, completely understated yet immediately effective. Langford, realizing he had underestimated Steven, tried to regain composure. He raised his glass, attempting to toast to the crowd, but the murmurs had grown into a subtle chorus of support for Steven. Even his closest allies could no longer mask their unease. By now, the whispers had reached the media's ears. Several journalists quietly started recording videos of Langford's attempts to maintain authority, juxtaposed against Steven's composed demeanor. It was clear that the narrative was shifting, and the room had begun recognizing who held the real power, not the billionaire flaunting his wealth, but the man who carried himself with respect and quiet confidence. Steven remained calm, offering a few gentle smiles and nods, never reveling in the discomfort of his detractor. His approach was subtle, almost invisible, yet its impact was undeniable. The room's energy had shifted, the scales tipping steadily away from arrogance and toward dignity. Have you ever witnessed someone underestimated because of appearances? Comment below with your story. Langford's posture stiffened as he realized that the small dismissive act of ignoring Steven's handshake was not just socially awkward, it was a potential financial misstep with serious consequences. Around him, the crowd's perception had changed completely, and quietly but unmistakably, Steven Seagal had begun to turn the tables without a single raised voice. The conference hall had grown tense. Whispers and low murmurs now rippled through the crowd, as attendees subtly shifted in their seats, observing the unfolding dynamic between Steven Seagal and Alexander Langford. Every glance Langford threw carried a mixture of disbelief and irritation. The earlier arrogance that had dominated his demeanor was fading. Langford, seated at the head of his table, decided to push further. "You don't belong here," he said loudly, addressing Steven directly, though he assumed the remark would go unchallenged. "This is serious business, not an event for entertainers or martial artists." The room fell silent. Heads turned, some recording with phones, others whispering to colleagues. Langford thought he was asserting dominance, but the effect was entirely opposite. The subtle power shift was unmistakable. Steven, standing near his table, looked Langford in the eye with unwavering calm. He didn't raise his voice, didn't flare with anger. Instead, he took a slow breath, his presence alone commanding the room's attention. "You're mistaken," Steven said evenly, his voice firm but measured. "It's not about what you think I am. It's about the respect we show one another. Wealth does not make you superior. Arrogance does not make you strong. True influence comes from character, not titles or bank accounts." A ripple ran through the audience. Phones clicked quietly, capturing the calm authority in his tone. People exchanged glances, realizing that Steven had spoken truth with clarity and composure. Even the most skeptical attendees were leaning in. Langford's face flushed. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but the room itself seemed to quiet him. Attendees subtly shifted their attention towards Steven, nodding in agreement or whispering about the wisdom in his words. Langford's allies looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to defend him or remain silent. One of Langford's assistants whispered, "Sir, maybe you should," but he trailed off, sensing the futility of trying to salvage the situation. Steven continued, his gaze steady. "Respect is not given because someone fears you. It is earned because people trust and value your integrity. Arrogance can destroy fortunes faster than any market crash ever could. Disrespect may feel like power, but it leaves nothing but regret in its wake." Langford's hand twitched slightly, a nervous gesture revealing the internal struggle of someone who realized he had miscalculated. He glanced around, noticing subtle shifts in body language. Investors leaning towards Steven in conversation, journalists recording every word, attendees quietly murmuring about the situation. The silence in the hall was now palpable. It wasn't just Steven speaking, it was the weight of every eye on him, the collective recognition of authority and dignity, that amplified his message. Langford's earlier bravado had dissolved into visible unease. Jaws dropped. Even Langford's closest business associates could no longer maintain composure, some exchanging uneasy glances. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that the man they had dismissed so casually held more influence than Langford had imagined. Steven's final words cut through the tension like a blade tempered in calm resolve. "I stand not to humiliate but to remind everyone here, your wealth does not define you, your respect for others does. Choose wisely." The room erupted, not with shouting but with quiet admiration and subtle applause. Phones recorded the moment, attendees nodded in agreement, and a few murmured acknowledgments of respect spread throughout the hall. Langford, pale and stunned, looked around for an escape. His confidence had crumbled under the weight of Steven's calm authority. He realized, too late, that the slight handshake insult had been a serious misjudgment. Steven Seagal, meanwhile, returned to his seat with the same composed dignity as when he had entered. No celebration, no arrogance, only a quiet reminder that true respect and influence needed neither showmanship nor force. Have you ever faced someone who disrespected you publicly? How did you respond? Share your experience in the comments below. The conference hall was now thick with anticipation. What had started as a casual business summit had transformed into a silent trial of character. Steven Seagal, composed and steady, remained a figure of quiet authority, while Alexander Langford's earlier arrogance had begun to crumble under the scrutiny of every attendee. By mid-morning, the whispers among investors grew louder. Several influential Asian investment partners, who had quietly been observing the interactions, exchanged discreet phone calls and private messages. They were well aware of Steven's role as a board member and respected his judgment. His calm handling of the disrespectful incident was a signal that Langford's conduct might indicate deeper issues in leadership. Langford, sensing something was off, tried to regain control. He raised his hand in a toast toward his table, attempting to display confidence, but the energy of the room had already shifted. Attendees who had previously laughed at Steven's modesty were now subtly aligning themselves with him, acknowledging his authority without a word. Minutes later, a group of senior investors approached the stage. They asked to speak directly with Steven, ensuring the meeting remained private. Langford, unaware of the approaching consequences, remained seated, still attempting to maintain a facade of control. Steven greeted the investors politely. They spoke briefly, nodding respectfully as he discussed business integrity, decision-making, and the long-term viability of projects. Afterward, they quietly shared their concerns about Langford's recent $3 billion venture, specifically noting his public display of arrogance and lack of consideration for character in his dealings. A subtle announcement was made. Several major investors would withdraw their support from Langford's $3 billion project, citing concerns about leadership, judgment, and the risks posed by his behavior. Murmurs swept through the room like wildfire. Phones clicked incessantly as journalists began recording the unfolding fallout, and attendees exchanged glances, realizing they were witnessing a historic reversal. Langford's face turned pale. His earlier smugness gave way to panic. He tried to interject, to appeal to the investors, but it was too late. The quiet respect Steven commanded had tipped the scales irreversibly. Every gesture of arrogance he had displayed now reflected poorly on him. Steven, however, remained composed. He did not gloat, did not deliver a verbal attack. Instead, he offered a calm smile and said to Langford quietly but firmly, "Respect is never something to be demanded. It is earned. Actions like yours today have consequences beyond what money can measure." The crowd's reaction was subtle but undeniable. Attendees nodded, murmured approval, and some recorded the moment. Langford's assistants exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the magnitude of the miscalculation. The room had shifted entirely in favor of Steven's calm authority. Langford attempted a handshake toward Steven, now a desperate gesture, but Steven did not reach for it. Instead, he shook his head slightly and replied, "I do not shake hands out of fear, only out of respect earned through integrity." The room erupted, not with loud applause, but with quiet admiration, whispers of respect, and the silent acknowledgement of power grounded in dignity. Investors and media personnel alike recognized the turning point. Langford slumped into his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down. He had lost more than face. He had lost the confidence of major investors and risked derailing a $3 billion deal in a matter of minutes. All because he had misjudged the calm authority of a man he had dismissed with a mere gesture. Do you think Langford deserved to lose his $3 billion deal after this incident? Share your opinion in the comments below. Steven, seated quietly now, exuded the same serene confidence that had marked his entry into the hall. Without anger, without arrogance, he had turned the tables completely, demonstrating that true influence is measured not by wealth or power, but by integrity, composure, and respect. The room had changed. Investors had shifted allegiances. Media had captured every interaction. And Alexander Langford, once so confident, was now learning a very public and very expensive lesson. By the afternoon, the story of the Global Investment Summit had already begun to spread far beyond the walls of the Grand Meridian Convention Center. Attendees, journalists, and investors who had witnessed the incident immediately shared videos and accounts on social media. Within hours, clips of Steven Seagal calmly handling Alexander Langford's arrogance were circulating across platforms, amassing millions of views. News outlets quickly picked up the story. Headlines flashed, "Billionaire loses $3 billion after publicly disrespecting Steven Seagal," and "Seagal shows true power of respect and composure." Analysts dissected the events, praising Seagal's measured approach and criticizing Langford's hasty arrogance. The narrative was clear. Integrity and respect could not be replaced by wealth or ego. Langford, meanwhile, faced growing scrutiny. Emails from investors flooded in. Phone calls from partners expressed concern. His advisors tried to spin the story, but the evidence was undeniable. Video clips had captured every interaction, every dismissive gesture, and the quiet authority of the man he had insulted. The $3 billion project he had once touted as unstoppable now hung in the balance. Steven Seagal, however, remained unshaken. He gave brief interviews to journalists, speaking softly but firmly. "No one should ever be judged by appearances," he said. "Respect and integrity are universal values. Disrespect can destroy more than relationships. It can destroy opportunities, trust, and, as we've seen today, entire projects." Social media amplified the lesson. Memes and commentary celebrated Steven's calm authority and the dramatic reversal of fortune. People across the globe admired his ability to stay composed under pressure, refusing to escalate conflict while still asserting his dignity. Comments poured in. Viewers shared personal stories of encountering arrogance and disrespect, drawing parallels to the summit incident. Some investors who were not present at the event began contacting Steven directly, seeking advice on leadership and conflict management. Others publicly stated that they were re-evaluating their business dealings with Langford, citing concerns about his judgment and temperament. The ripple effect extended far beyond the summit itself. Langford's reputation, once untouchable, had begun to unravel. Steven remained gracious throughout. In private, he reminded his colleagues and the media that the lesson was not about revenge, nor about personal triumph. "This is about how we treat others," he emphasized. "Small acts of respect, or disrespect, carry consequences far beyond what we might imagine." Meanwhile, Alexander Langford attempted to salvage his image, issuing statements about misunderstandings and unfortunate interactions. But the videos were undeniable, and the public had already made its judgment. The narrative was set. The arrogant billionaire had lost face, opportunity, and credibility, all because he failed to recognize the quiet power of composure and respect. If you believe in respect and equality, type respect in the comments below. By the end of the day, the summit's story had gone global. The footage of Steven Seagal had not only reshaped public opinion about Langford but also reinforced an enduring truth. Wealth and status do not substitute for integrity. Influence is earned, not assumed, and respect is always a two-way street. The $3 billion loss served as a stark reminder to the business world. Decisions based on arrogance rather than consideration can have instant, irreversible consequences. And through it all, Steven Seagal's quiet, composed dignity remained a model of leadership, demonstrating that real power often comes not from domination, but from calm courage, respect, and moral authority. By nightfall, the hashtag #RespectSeagal was trending worldwide, and countless viewers had shared their own lessons about humility, integrity, and the long-term power of respect. The world had witnessed a remarkable moment, one in which a simple handshake, and the decision to honor it, altered the course of billions of dollars and reshaped perceptions of true authority.